What's up guys, my name is Ace, and it's that time of the year where we're going to be looking back at Infinite Warfare, and today I'm going to be looking at what Infinite Warfare did wrong. We've already covered the opposite video of what Infinite Warfare did right. I will leave that link down below if you want to go check that out. And just a disclaimer at the beginning of this video, I do want to mention that generally I really thoroughly enjoyed Infinite Warfare throughout its entire life cycle. So I do like it, but having said that, I'm not going to be holding back in this video. I'm going to be sharing all the things that I feel Infinite Warfare did wrong. Let's get into it. Alright guys, again, I feel like I have to mention this every single time. Everything I say here is my opinion based on my preferences and my experiences, so a lot of this is going to be subjective. The number one thing I wanted to mention here at the beginning of this video, and it's going to be a little bit different than a lot of the rest of the stuff that comes throughout this video because it's not one really specific thing that's wrong with the game. This is timing. One of the biggest failures of this game is simply the time that it came out. At this point in the franchise's life cycle, just coming off of Advanced Warfare as well as Black Ops 3, there was definitely a lot of fatigue in the community with the Advanced movement. There's a ton of people that didn't like it in the first place, and then there's a bunch of other people that have kind of grown bored of it and they want to go back to that old school feel, and therefore the timing was just terrible to drop Infinite Warfare at this point. I truly feel that if Infinite Warfare would have dropped instead of Ghost back before Advanced Warfare and immediately following Black Ops 2, it would have been a very different reception. I realize this one might come off as a bit of an excuse for the developers because it's not something they really could have predicted, or maybe they could have, and hindsight is always 20/20, but I do think that is one of the biggest issues with this game. Now let's have a look at the things that I feel the developers didn't do a very good job with or made poor decisions with that were at least somewhat under their control. First up, this is something that's mentioned quite a bit in the community from the people that dislike this game. It was incomplete at launch. There were definitely some features missing at launch. I would say almost all of them were non-gameplay features, but we didn't have leaderboards. We didn't have a way to even see your own stats for the first little bit. We eventually got that Ghost-style system where you can see other people's stats in the lobby and you can see your own, a very limited number of stats, not like a full combat record. But we didn't have a combat record or a leaderboard or a custom emblem editor until several months down the road. These are features that absolutely should have been there at some point within the launch window. Moving on to something else that I feel like they didn't handle very well, this is Synaptic. Even though Synaptic has the same size hitbox as the other player models, the way those hitboxes are positioned is a little bit different than the other models, which can make it a little bit harder to shoot at them. And also there is that placebo effect where the player model is skinnier than the hitbox, and this placebo effect was very prevalent in the community and a lot of people felt like they couldn't hit this bot. They would have been much better off going with a player model that was more comparable to Ethan in the campaign. This was a much thicker player model, it would have matched up much better with the other rigs in the game, and then people likely wouldn't have had that particular complaint about him. But that's not the end of the complaints with him. Another one is propulsion. I strongly feel propulsion should not have been attached to a combat rig, and honestly I don't think it should have been in the game at all with how much you can boost in this particular game. All the other traits with Synaptic I think were just fine. It was just propulsion that was a big issue. They finally now got it to a point where it's not so much of an issue, but for the majority of the life cycle of the game, propulsion was absolutely too powerful and for a lot of really good players, a crutch trait attached to a rig. One final thing to mention with Synaptic is I feel Rewind was a little bit too powerful as well. Now I understand that there's a lot of other great payloads in the game, and I think some elements of Rewind work just fine. For instance, rewinding back in time to a previous position, totally cool by me. Even refilling your ammo I think is a great perk of this payload. However, I don't think you should also be regenerating health. That was the one thing that tipped this just a little bit over the edge for me, and I feel like that combined with the other traits of Synaptic made this rig too powerful for a certain playstyle. Moving on to the next thing, this is some of the variants in the game, specifically some of the Quartermaster Collection variants. So these are the variants that you can only get through supply drops. There is no way to actually earn these particular variants. You can only get lucky with them. For the ones that you can actually earn and craft with salvage, totally fine with them. But there's a select few in the Quartermaster Collection that I have an issue with. These are the ones that fundamentally change how the gun behaves. If you watch the video about what they did right, I love the way they handled this system where everybody gets the base gun for free, either by completing a challenge or if you're a season pass holder, you just get it instantly. I was also fine with them locking most of the variants behind the Quartermaster collection because you still got that base experience, so it was still pretty much the same gun, you could still get a good feel for it, but you didn't have those added perks attached to it. However, there are a few variants in here that completely change the way the gun behaves, and therefore you now are missing out on a new experience. The ones that come to mind here are, first off, all of the variants aside from the common of the G-Rail, because these ones, for each one of the variants, it's a different number of shots it fires within a burst, and it actually turns a semi-auto into a burst weapon. So for those ones, you can only get that unique experience by getting lucky and getting those out of drops. Also, the Augur Fury, that's another one that I was a little bit disappointed with. At least that gun's not extremely powerful by any means, but still, that's an experience that I personally would love to experience, and there's no way of me doing that unless I get lucky with a supply drop. And finally, there's two more variants in here that I wanted to mention. With one of them, which is the VPR Yokai, this one doesn't fundamentally change how the gun behaves, so it's not like you're really missing out on the experience, but it's the perk attached to it, as well as the next one, which is the Epic Raijin. This is the only perk in the game that allows enemy skulls to not appear when you kill your enemies. And this perk was completely locked behind supply drops. If this perk was available on some of the weapons in the other collection where you could actually craft them with salvage, I wouldn't have nearly as much of an issue with this. But since that perk is specifically attached to supply drop only weapons, I'm not happy with the way they handled that one. Next up is something that doesn't really impact the average player out there, but for me and for a lot of other players, we were very disappointed to not have a proper feature for this. This is some kind of ranked play or league play. And I'm talking about proper ranked play or league play. Not just the weak competitive playlist they had added into this game after the fact, and not their MLG game battle system, which I will admit that is a pretty cool system, but still, it's not a proper replacement for an actual league play or ranked play system. I'm extremely disappointed they didn't add this feature into the game. It's something that I fell in love with back in Black Ops 2, and there is a growing portion of the community that needs that sort of feature, or really craves that sort of feature, and Infinite Warfare simply didn't cut it in this area. Moving on to the weekly contract system in Infinite Warfare, I'm glad they brought it into the game, but I feel like it wasn't implemented properly. The challenges themselves were laughable for the most part. For a lot of players, many of these challenges could be completed within 1 to 5 games, and that's it for a weekly challenge. And they never did make it more challenging or more grindy or more difficult. A weekly challenge is something that should at least take you a few different play sessions to complete. I realize they want it to be accessible for even the casual players that don't jump on all the time, but even when you consider that, these should have been more daily challenges than weekly challenges. Next up is something that I was quite disappointed not to see, but then again, this is coming off of Black Ops 3. This is some sort of party or group system. A better way to connect with people you want to play with, and make it easier to find the people that you want to play with, and get groups together and find like-minded people to play with. That was an excellent feature in Black Ops 3, and I was very disappointed to not see it return in Infinite Warfare. I realize they're different developers, and with Black Ops 3, that was the first time we saw a system like that, but it's something that I feel should absolutely become a staple with the series, and I'm disappointed that they didn't at least add it at some point throughout the Infinite Warfare lifecycle. I would have been totally fine if this system wasn't there at launch, and then they worked on it throughout the year to get it implemented into the game, but we're past the 11-month mark, and we still don't have a feature like this. Next up is a relatively big thing. I wanted to kind of spread the big things out throughout this video. This is the mechanical skill gap. I'm being very careful with my words here saying mechanical skill gap because this game requires a different set of skills compared to a lot of previous Call of Duty games, and it definitely triggers people when I say that this game has a higher skill gap when I'm referring to the actual gameplay mechanics. In this game, with the movement system the way it is, as well as the longest time to kill in the Call of Duty franchise on average, it absolutely has, in my opinion at least, the highest mechanical skill gap in the series. And what I mean by mechanical skill gap is not necessarily your tactical skill, so your ability to approach situations properly and use cover to your advantage and move from cover to cover and understand the map and the flow and everything. Even though that stuff is still somewhat important in Infinite Warfare, it's more so focused on the mechanics of the game, being able to evade shots while also hitting your shots quickly and accurately. This is something that a lot of players adapted to and absolutely mastered. And this became a barrier to entry. These guys are doing things that new players can't even dream of, they can't keep up with. I see a lot of people complain about the fact that Infinite Warfare is too random. I can understand for a newer player just getting into the game how it would feel that way. It would feel like everything's completely random. You can't keep up with what's going on around you. You're being absolutely destroyed by these people that are flying around all over the place. The simple fact is, those people have adapted to the core mechanics of this game and they developed skills that newer players just can't keep up with on average. I strongly feel this is one of the big factors that turn people away from this game when they first hop on. You always hear from people that are saying, I hopped on, I tried playing for like a few hours or a few gameplay sessions, and I just couldn't get with it because it was too random. There was too much stuff going on. So I feel Infinity Ward possibly overlooked this increase in the mechanical skill gap with their new mechanics in their game because, yes, I know they're similar to Black Ops 3, but Black Ops 3's movement mechanics you couldn't take advantage of quite as much as you can in Infinite Warfare. Jump shotting in a gunfight, for instance, isn't nearly as helpful in Black Ops 3 compared to Infinite Warfare. And I feel like they overlooked this, and this created a barrier to entry, and also it turned a lot of people away that simply couldn't keep up when they first hopped in. Next up, something that I feel Infinity Ward didn't do a good job with, this is presentation. I'm talking about the presentation of the graphics and the art style of their gameplay. In the video where I was talking about what Infinite Warfare did right, I mentioned that I loved the vibrant colors, I loved the art style, I loved all that kind of stuff, and then people were leaving comments disagreeing with me, and that reminded me that I tweaked a bunch of settings to make sure my contrast and my saturation and everything was balanced just right for this game, and when I do that, this game looks incredible. It looks great, but then I remembered when you first plug this game in, and you just set your brightness settings in-game, you don't mess around with any sort of contrast, saturation, you don't disable motion blur, and you don't turn film grain all the way down, this game has very poor presentation, in my opinion. Now that seems to be a clear choice that they made, that's how they wanted their game to look, but I don't think it was the right choice for the Call of Duty audience in general. Moving on to the next thing that I feel Infinite Warfare did wrong, this is such a minor thing, but it's something that affects me almost every single game. When you're in the middle of the game and somebody's joining that game mid-session, you can't mute their microphone until they fully join the game. You guys have probably all experienced this at some point if you actually played the game. You'll be in the middle of a game and suddenly you hear somebody's mic just blaring. It can be a really loud, obnoxious sound. They might be screaming into the mic. They might be eating their microphone. I don't know what they're doing, but they're making all kinds of noise on their microphone. You pull up the scoreboard to go mute them, which would be no problem. And you can't find them there. They're not on the scoreboard yet because they haven't actually joined right into the game. They've just joined your lobby. This is something that I feel should have been a relatively easy fix, but it never did get fixed. And while it is really small, like I said, this happens almost every single game it feels like, or very, very frequently at least, several times in a gaming session. And it can be quite frustrating. I understand there's a workaround where you can just join a private party by yourself, but sometimes I do want to hear what other people are saying in the lobbies and I want to talk to them a little bit. So you shouldn't have to be going through all these extra steps to avoid these issues. Next up, this is weapon balance in hardcore modes. Now, I don't really play much hardcore, but anytime I have, and I always hear the complaints about this, the NV4 is used by almost everybody, and for good reason. It's accurate, and if you have the flatline variant, it's a one-shot kill anywhere. So in hardcore, there's really not much reason to use anything else. The NV4 is clearly superior to everything in almost every single situation in hardcore modes, and there's actually a relatively simple fix that wouldn't have an impact on the effectiveness of the gun in core modes. All they would have had to do is create a 29 damage range for the NV4. They could have set that at something like 25 to 30 meters, and this would have no impact on the gun whatsoever in core modes because the difference between 29 and a 30 damage is pretty much nothing. But in hardcore modes, that would make it so now it will drop off to a two-shot kill much sooner. This one simple change would have made for so much more variety in hardcore instantly. And it's really unfortunate for the hardcore players out there that they didn't do this. Moving on to the next thing, this is something I mentioned in my What Infinite Warfare Did Right video. It was one of the exceptions about what they did right. This is the Ghost perk. With the Ghost perk in this game, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a crutch perk, but I will say there's no reason not to be using the Ghost perk because it works all the time like Call of Duty's from way back in the day. Even as somebody that uses Ghost on most of his classes, I strongly feel that Ghost should have only worked when you're moving. Kind of like Black Ops 3 for instance. Of course they can play around with the thresholds a little bit, so they can make it so you can be stationary for a few seconds or something like that. But as it is in this game, Ghost is working for you all the time, and therefore it can encourage people to camp and it can reward people more for camping. So this is definitely subjective, but personally, I would absolutely prefer it if Ghost only worked while you were on the move. So finally, on my list here of what Infinite Warfare did wrong, these are the bugs that occurred specifically right after larger updates. The one that I'm primarily talking about here, although there were some other bugs, this is the update requires restart loop. So when you boot up the game after an update, it tells you that you need to restart the app, and it just keeps doing that over and over again. You can't actually get into the game. There were a couple workarounds like boot up Modern Warfare Remastered, and then through there you can boot up Infinite Warfare. There's a couple different things, but a lot of the time, the only solution to this was to completely uninstall and reinstall the game. Now, bugs in games like this absolutely do happen, and I can forgive them to an extent. The issue with this one is that it's still happening today to some people, and it happens so frequently throughout the life cycle. It popped up way too often. Personally, I experienced it twice this year. I know my girlfriend has experienced it at least once or twice. I have tons of followers coming to me pretty much after every one of my updates saying, "What do I do here? I can't fix this issue." And therefore, it's pretty clear that this is not just one of those isolated incidents with a little bit of a bug. This was a relatively major and recurring issue that they never did fix. So that's going to wrap it up for my list of what Infinite Warfare did wrong. Like I said at the beginning, after talking all negative about the game, I do want to reiterate that overall, I loved this game. I enjoyed this game. It had its issues, just like any Call of Duty game, and those are the issues that I personally saw. I'd like to know in the comment section below, and I'm going to give you guys full reign here. In your opinion, what did Infinite Warfare do wrong this year? The one thing I'm going to add here is please don't be that guy that just says everything and then doesn't offer any sort of explanation, doesn't go into any detail. Please elaborate a little bit. Tell me what went wrong in your opinion. Anytime I see those comments where somebody's just like, they did everything wrong, but they don't even explain, to me, that just looks like you're a part of the hate bandwagon and you probably didn't even play the game. So please elaborate a little bit. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.